Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the shadowed corridors of history, where suspicion alone could ruin a life. You find yourself wandering through a medieval castle at night, its stone walls slick with damp, the air thick with the smell of smoke from torches guttering in iron brackets. Somewhere in the distance, a lute plays a soft and mournful tune, and it's easy to imagine that every note is carrying some secret, some rumor that might mean doom for a woman behind these very walls. This isn't just a ghost story, though it might feel like one. It's about the cruel fate of women accused of infidelity, a fate that was often as swift as it was merciless. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, emotionally at least, because the stories are heavier than the stone arches looming above your head. Still, you've stepped into this world with me, and so we'll move carefully together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere far away, maybe in a tiny apartment or a farmhouse on the edge of nowhere, post your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where all of you are tuning in from. It's like building our own map of sleepless travelers. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the castle and pause, listening. The silence is not comforting, it's loaded, heavy, waiting. And that's how it often was for women in history, where even silence could be dangerous. You learn quickly that in societies obsessed with honor, inheritance, and appearances, nothing was more threatening to the social order than the idea of an unfaithful wife. Whether queen, noblewoman, or peasant, a woman could find herself condemned not because she was guilty, but simply because suspicion hovered around her like smoke after a fire. In medieval Europe, a whisper carried weight. A single maidservant's report of her mistress laughing too freely with a knight could set off a chain of destruction. Think about that, a laugh. Something that today would hardly raise an eyebrow might then have been interpreted as damning evidence of betrayal, and once rumors took hold, they were nearly impossible to shake. People believed what they wanted to believe, especially if believing it gave them leverage, or entertainment, or someone to blame for larger problems. Historians still argue whether women accused of infidelity were more often victims of political intrigue or victims of genuine suspicion by jealous husbands. The truth, as always, is messy. But what's clear is that the halls of power echoed with whispered accusations. Behind every tapestry, someone was listening. Behind every door, someone was watching. And for women, every glance could become a weapon. You might not expect this, but in some places entire rituals of suspicion existed. For example, in ancient Rome, long before medieval castles even rose, there was a law called the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coescendis. Try saying that 3 times fast without sounding like you swallowed a marble. Under this law, husbands were legally obligated to divorce their wives if they suspected infidelity, and failure to act could lead to charges against the husband himself. Imagine the paranoia that created. Not only could a wife be punished for suspicion alone, but a husband could be punished for not punishing her enough. Talk about marital stress. Even in later centuries, when castles loomed and crowns glittered, the essence remained the same. Suspicion was poison. And the cruel irony? While women were crushed under the weight of rumor, men were often applauded for their own affairs. Kings with mistresses filled palaces with illegitimate children, while queens faced exile or death for the mere suggestion of impropriety. That's not just hypocrisy, it's weaponized hypocrisy. You shuffle further through the castle in your mind, and you hear the creak of the great hall doors swinging shut behind you. The walls here seem to breathe with old stories. Stories of women who were tried in courts, not of law but of opinion, where evidence was gossip and verdicts were foregone conclusions. A mainstream historical fact often glossed over is that noble courts, particularly in France, had so-called courts of love, gatherings where noblemen and women debated issues of romance and loyalty. Sounds sweet, right? Like a medieval version of a talk show. But sometimes these courts were used to publicly shame women accused of being unfaithful, dressing the humiliation up as witty entertainment. On the fringe, there were even stranger ideas. One medieval text insisted that a woman's guilt could be detected by her eyes, that if she had looked upon another man with desire, her pupils would betray her. Yes, because apparently medieval science was one long episode of bad detective television. Of course, this nonsense gave accusers yet another excuse to claim proof when none existed. You stand there in the castle's long corridor, torchlight flickering on the stones, and you realize how fragile safety was for women across centuries. To be accused was to be caught in a net you couldn't escape. You couldn't laugh, couldn't look, couldn't linger too long in conversation without wondering, who is watching, who is whispering? And that whisper, that tiny, poisonous thread of suspicion, was often enough to bind a woman's fate forever. You find yourself pausing at the threshold of a narrow stone passageway, the kind that twists and turns so sharply you feel as if the walls themselves are watching you. It's in these shadowed corners that glances once lived, furtive looks across banquet tables, stolen eye contact during dances, or perhaps a gaze that lingered a fraction too long. You wouldn't think a glance could carry the weight of a death sentence, but for women in many centuries, it did. Ever wondered how fragile reputations could be? Picture yourself at a grand feast in a medieval court. The fire roars in the hearth, roasting meats and filling the air with a greasy warmth, while goblets of wine are passed around. Everyone is watching everyone. The nobleman seated across the table smiles faintly at you, no words, no touch, just a smile, and suddenly the room feels colder, because someone else sees it too. And in this game of thrones and gossip, that smile could be transformed into evidence of betrayal. The unspoken danger of glances shaped lives in ways modern eyes can barely comprehend. Husbands could seize on the smallest detail, neighbors could whisper, and suddenly accusations took form. In Renaissance Italy, for example, even flirting could be interpreted as proof of adultery, since temptation was seen as almost the same as the act itself. One mainstream fact historians emphasize is that in many European regions, adultery was classified as both a sin and a crime, a double burden that made even suspicion nearly impossible to escape. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, people actually believed that the body carried physical traces of infidelity. For instance, a woman accused might be subjected to having her hair examined, as tangled or unkempt strands were said to prove she had been in bed with another man. It sounds absurd now, like something from a medieval beauty magazine gone wrong. 10 ways to spot if she's been unfaithful, number 7 will shock you. But back then, these so-called signs carried real weight in trials and punishments. Historians still argue whether these accusations were sincerely believed by communities or cynically used by husbands and families to dispose of inconvenient wives. The debate matters because it reveals whether societies were blinded by genuine paranoia or driven by calculated cruelty. Either way, the result for women was the same, a trap from which there was no graceful exit. You shuffle further down the passage in your imagination, your footsteps echoing against stone. Think of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's doomed queen. Before her fall, courtiers whispered about the way she laughed too freely, about the spark in her eyes when she spoke to men who were not her husband. Glances were recast as seduction, and seduction as treason. When the axe finally fell, it was justified by a web of looks and smiles inflated into treachery. The irony? Men were free to cast glances wherever they wished. A king could gaze upon any lady-in-waiting and no one dared accuse him. But if a queen returned a glance, or even if she didn't, rumor filled the void. This double standard, baked into law and custom, left women vulnerable to charges that no amount of innocence could overturn. There's something chilling about it, isn't there? The idea that you could live every day knowing your fate might hinge on something as fleeting as a momentary look. Imagine the constant self-policing, the careful arrangement of your eyes and your smile. Too cold and you risked offending someone powerful. Too warm and you risked being branded a traitor. to your marriage. It was a balancing act on a rope stretched across a pit where the crowd below jeered and waited for you to fall. And fall, many did. Some were dragged before local courts, others faced the humiliation of public scolding. You might be locked in a pillory, your face exposed for all to see, while neighbours hurled insults, or worse, rotten food. Others were condemned quietly, shut away in convents or behind castle doors where their absence was explained away with vague excuses. But sometimes it was worse. A queen accused of betraying her king didn't just risk her own life, she risked her family's honour, her children's legitimacy, and the stability of entire kingdoms. One look, one smile, one whisper could ripple outward until entire nations trembled. As you reach the end of the stone passage in your imagination, you notice the torches sputter and fade. Ahead lies the great hall, vast and echoing, where accusations were once spoken aloud and glances were transformed into weapons, sharper than any blade. You shiver not from the cold, but from the weight of knowing that something so small, so human, could be twisted into a sentence of shame, exile, or death. The unspoken danger of glances still lingers in the air like a ghost that refuses to leave these halls. You step into the great hall now, its rafters rising high above you, heavy with soot from centuries of torches and braziers. The vast chamber carries echoes, footsteps, muttered words, the occasional clatter of a goblet, and those echoes seem to remind you that power, when mingled with paranoia, could warp into cruelty with terrifying ease. Here, in the space where kings held court and queens tried to maintain dignity, barren beds often became battlefields. It might surprise you, but in many royal households, the absence of children was not viewed as nature's mischief. It was viewed as a personal failure, and often that failure was laid squarely on the queen. If heirs did not arrive, suspicion soon followed. Was she barren, cursed, or, whisper it, was she secretly betraying her husband? After all, what better explanation for the lack of heirs than treachery in the marital bed? Take the case of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's spirited independence made Louis distrust her, or whether the whispers of her supposed flirtations at court fueled their eventual annulment. Either way, the absence of a male heir gave fuel to the idea that she might not have been the loyal queen France demanded. She was shipped off quite literally and remarried, becoming Queen of England instead. The irony is sharp. A woman blamed for barrenness became mother to a brood of children who shaped European history. Now picture Henry VIII again, because honestly, how could we not? His desperation for a male heir led him to view his wives not as partners, but as wombs on trial. Catherine of Aragon, after years without a surviving son, was cast aside under the guise of an annulment, the king claiming their marriage was cursed. Anne Boleyn, though initially his great passion, soon faced the same suspicion when no son arrived. The accusations of infidelity against her, crafted with alarming creativity, included alleged affairs with musicians and even her own brother. It was not just her body on trial, but her very presence as a queen who had failed to provide what the king demanded. That's the cruel fate of royal paranoia. The bedroom became the courtroom, and the absence of children became the evidence. You probably wouldn't want your fertility, or lack of it, debated by an entire nation, but queens had no choice. Their bodies were state property, and suspicion grew in the spaces where babies didn't. On the fringe, some physicians offered bizarre explanations. One theory suggested that if a queen failed to conceive, she must have been secretly lying with another man whose seed was somehow weaker and unable to produce heirs. That's not science, it's medieval gossip masquerading as biology. Still, these odd notions found their way into the whisper networks of courts, and a barren queen became not just pitied, but suspect. Meanwhile, the king's own role was rarely questioned. A monarch could father children with mistresses, proving, conveniently, that any infertility issue must lie with the wife. The logic was skewed, But in a patriarchal system, logic was less important than preserving the king's honor. And here's where the double standard strikes again. A king without heirs could remarry, divorce, or cast blame with little consequence. A queen without heirs could lose her crown, or her head. Imagine lying awake at night in some massive, drafty chamber of stone, knowing your worth would be measured not by your kindness, intelligence, or leadership, but by whether a cradle rocked in the nursery. You glance around the hall in your mind, and you see tapestries depicting hunting scenes, kings with falcons on their wrists, and queens painted serene at their sides. But those serene faces hide the storm of suspicion that brewed whenever heirs failed to arrive. Historians still argue whether accusations of infidelity in barren queens were ever genuinely believed or whether they were politically convenient lies. After all, a king who wanted a new wife had to justify it somehow. Accusations of betrayal made for a cleaner narrative than simply saying, "I'm bored." As you stand in the echoing hall, you realize that royal paranoia was not just about the bedroom, it was about power. A barren queen threatened dynasties, succession, and entire nations. Her body was a symbol, and when that symbol didn't deliver, suspicion twisted into cruelty. And so, in castles across Europe, the fate of a queen was written not only in her womb, but in the way her husband and his court chose to interpret her silence, her smile, and her empty cradle. You step further into the imagined hall, and the noise of the feast fades, replaced by something harsher, the murmur of a crowd gathering outside, eager for a show. The door creaks open, and you glimpse the wooden scaffold waiting in the town square, not for an execution this time, but for something many accused women feared just as much, public shame rituals. Ever wondered what it felt like to be condemned not with swords or shackles, but with humiliation so carefully staged it burned deeper than any wound? In many European towns, women accused of infidelity were paraded through streets not as criminals in chains, but as living spectacles of ridicule. The punishment wasn't always meant to kill, it was designed to strip away dignity, one mocking jeer at a time. A mainstream historical fact worth noting. In the Holy Roman Empire, women accused of marital betrayal could be subjected to the Shan mask, literally, the shame mask. These grotesque iron contraptions, shaped like pigs or donkeys, were locked onto the woman's head as she was forced to walk through the marketplace. Bells often dangled from the mask, jingling with each step, announcing her disgrace to every passerby. Imagine the sound, tinny, relentless, a constant reminder that she was now marked forever. On the fringes of history, there are tales of even more bizarre punishments. In some German towns, women accused of adultery were made to ride backward on donkeys through the streets, clutching the tail like reins while the crowd laughed and hurled insults. It sounds like a grotesque carnival act, but for the women living it, it was closer to psychological torture. The inversion of dignity, forcing a woman to sit backwards, symbolized how she had supposedly turned her marriage upside down. Historians still argue whether these punishments served primarily as deterrence, or whether they were simply communal entertainment dressed up as morality. After all, what better way to reinforce the fragile egos of men than by turning women's supposed sins into street theatre? You imagine standing there in the square, the air sharp with the smell of hay, sweat, and smoke from the blacksmith's forge nearby. The accused woman stumbles as jeers echo around her, children running ahead to throw clumps of mud, elders shaking their heads with sanctimonious disgust. Some neighbors might secretly pity her, but few would dare to show it. Silence was safer than sympathy. And this wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. Even centuries later, in colonial New England, public shame became a cornerstone of punishment. Think of the Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne's fictional punishment reflected a very real tradition. A capital A stitched to a woman's clothing wasn't just symbolic, it was a lifetime sentence of whispers, stares, and exclusion. The community didn't need iron masks or donkeys when embroidery could do the same work, turn a woman into a walking billboard of disgrace. You probably wouldn't enjoy being forced to carry a sign, broadcasting your alleged sins while everyone you knew gawked at you, Yet for many women that was daily life after accusations stuck. And here's the cruelest irony. Even if later proven innocent, the stain rarely lifted. Once paraded in shame, you could never walk freely again. There's a strange, dark humor buried in some accounts. In certain towns, women accused of infidelity were punished by being forced to wear men's clothing in public, the idea being that since they had behaved like men, they should now look the part. Can you picture the absurdity? A medieval woman trussed up in oversized breeches, stumbling through muddy streets while onlookers cackled. It's slapstick with a cruel edge, proof that humiliation was often more important than justice. As you watch this ritual unfold in your imagination, you notice how the crowd feeds on itself. One person jeers, another throws a rotten apple, and soon the whole town is swept up in the frenzy. It's less about the accused and more about the community reminding itself, this is what happens when you step outside the bounds. And so the woman becomes both victim and lesson, a warning painted in flesh and shame. Public rituals of disgrace weren't just punishments. They were performances, staged again and again to keep the unspoken rules alive. The crowd disperses eventually, the laughter fading into the alleys. But the echo of those bells, the jingle of the shame mask, seems to linger in the night air, long after the square is empty. You move past the emptied square in your mind, the echoes of laughter and jeers still trailing behind you. Ahead lies a darker chamber, a place where punishment shifted from mockery to menace. Here you see the flicker of firelight dancing across water cauldrons and iron rods. This is the domain of trial by ordeal, a cruel invention where women accused of infidelity were forced to prove their innocence, not by words or evidence, but by suffering. Ever wondered how you'd fare if your entire reputation, your very life, depended on plunging your arm into boiling water? Because that's exactly what some women had to do. In medieval Europe, trials by ordeal were seen as divine judgments. The logic, or twisted theology, went like this. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm. If you were guilty, the burns or wounds would expose the truth. Simple, right? Except not at all, because boiling water doesn't exactly pause for piety. One mainstream historical fact is that ordeals were officially sanctioned by both church and secular courts well into the 13th century. Women suspected of adultery might be ordered to pick a stone from the bottom of a pot of boiling water, hold a red-hot iron for several paces, or be bound and thrown into a river to see if they floated. Float, and you were guilty. Sink, and you were innocent, though also dead. You probably wouldn't sign up for that kind of justice system. On the fringe of these ordeals are some truly strange details. In parts of Eastern Europe, women accused of marital betrayal were forced to walk barefoot, cross glowing ploughshares heated in fire. The idea was that only an unblemished soul could tread across molten metal without injury. Spoiler: almost nobody walked away unscathed. The punishment was less a test of truth than a performance of pain, reinforcing the community's need to see guilt acted out, whether it was real or not. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were sincerely believed as divine interventions or whether everyone involved secretly knew they were rigged to produce predictable results. Some scholars suggest priests and officials might have cooled the water or shortened the walk for those they favored, essentially letting bias dictate the outcome. Either way, for most women, the odds were stacked brutally against them. You picture the scene, a stone courtyard, smoke rising from the brazier, the crowd pressing closer, craning their necks to see the moment of truth. The accused woman's hands tremble as she's guided forward, her face pale in the torchlight. Someone mutters a prayer, someone else mutters an insult. Then the plunge, skin against heat, flesh against fire, and a collective gasp as she pulls her hand free, blistered and red. Does the wound heal cleanly? That's for the court to decide. In practice, it was just another excuse to condemn. The irony is almost unbearable. These trials were supposed to let God decide, but in reality they were shaped by human hands. Biased judges, scheming neighbors, jealous husbands. Divine justice was little more than a costume thrown over very earthly cruelty. And yet, there's a strange moment of reflection here. For all the brutality, people genuinely believed that ordeals revealed truth. In a world where medicine was rudimentary and science was practically sorcery, pain became a tool of judgment. It wasn't logical, but it was consistent with how people understood the cosmos. Suffering revealed sin. You shuffle back from the brazier in your imagination, your skin prickling as though the heat were real. The crowd disperses again, their curiosity satisfied, their suspicions confirmed, regardless of the outcome. The woman, guilty or not, is left scarred, physically, socially, spiritually, and the cruelest part. Even surviving the ordeal rarely erased suspicion. Scars lingered, whispers lingered, and the shadow of accusation followed women long after the fire had died. You leave the imagined courtyard now, the smell of scorched iron and boiled water fading into a different kind of heat, the smouldering embers of gossip. If ordeals were fire, gossip was smoke, spreading unseen, filling every corner, suffocating women accused before they even stepped into a courtroom. The poisoned chalice of gossip was often more devastating than any official punishment, because once words left someone's lips, they could never be pulled back. Picture yourself in a small medieval village where houses lean against one another like gossiping neighbors themselves. A baker's wife glances too long at a farmer in the market, and by the time the loaf cools on the table, the story has grown teeth. She's meeting him in secret, she's neglecting her husband, she's committing sins that only the priest should describe. By evening, it's not one farmer, it's 3. And by the end of the week, half the town is convinced she's pregnant by someone else. One mainstream historical fact: gossip wasn't just idle chatter. In many medieval courts, especially in England, something called the presentment of juries allowed communities to bring accusations forward based solely on rumour. That meant that if enough neighbours repeated the same story, it could become a legal case. You probably wouldn't want your life decided by the medieval equivalent of a neighbourhood Facebook group. But gossip didn't always need the law to be lethal. Sometimes it was enough to destroy reputations, isolate women socially, and make them vulnerable to harsher accusations. In Florence during the Renaissance, being labelled a cortigiana, a courtesan, or worse, a common adulteress, could end a noblewoman's place in society overnight. She might still live in her gilded home, but the invitations to feasts and weddings stopped coming, and soon she was a ghost in her own community. On the fringe, you find stories of magical gossip cures. In some rural parts of Europe, women accused of infidelity tried to clear their names by performing rituals, walking backward around their homes at midnight, or tying herbs into knots while reciting prayers. Supposedly, these charms would silence wagging tongues. Of course, whether they worked depended less on herbs and more on whether neighbours were willing to let the story die. Spoiler, they usually weren't. Historians still argue whether gossip spread more from genuine belief or from malice. Was it fear of women's independence, sexuality and influence, that fueled the rumours? Or was it simply boredom, the thrill of telling a dangerous tale in a world with so few forms of entertainment? Either way, gossip had teeth, and once it bit, it rarely let go. You walk through the narrow lanes of that imagined village, the smell of bread mingling with dung in the gutters, and everywhere you hear murmurs. A window creaks open. Did you hear about her? A voice from the well. She's been seen with him again. A laugh from behind you. We all know what that means. You can't pinpoint the origin, because gossip doesn't have one. It spreads like mist, impossible to catch, impossible to stop. The cruel irony is that women themselves were often both victims and participants. Some joined in the chorus of gossip to protect themselves, offering up others as sacrificial scapegoats. After all, in a world where suspicion could fall on anyone, better it fall on your neighbour than on you. It's survival disguised as cruelty, and it kept the poisoned chalice brimming. And you might laugh at the thought, but gossip left physical traces too. In some German towns, women were punished not for infidelity itself, but for scolding, basically talking too much. Devices like the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a tongue clamp, silenced women accused of spreading or fueling gossip. The irony? Those same communities lived and breathed on whispered stories about others. You leave the village behind in your imagination, but the whispers follow you, faint but relentless. Gossip doesn't fade. It mutates, grows, and seeps into memory. Even centuries later, historians comb through records of accusations and often find that the only evidence given was "people said." And for countless women, "people said" was enough to drink from the poisoned chalice of suspicion, a bitter cup they never chose to raise. You find yourself moving from the noisy village lanes into a quieter, colder place, the dim interior of a chapel. Candles flicker, throwing shadows across stone walls carved with saints and angels, but instead of comfort, the space feels heavy. Because here, the confessional, supposedly a safe refuge for souls, often became a trap. Women accused of infidelity learned quickly that piety could be twisted into punishment. Ever wondered how private your secrets really were, in an age when priests wielded more power than kings in some towns? Step closer. You kneel on the hard wood, press your forehead against the grate, and whisper to the priest behind the screen. Maybe you're only confessing a passing thought, a fleeting temptation, something as small as, "I admired another man's voice." In your mind, you've been honest, doing what the church demands. But outside, that admission could become evidence, twisted into proof that your heart already betrayed your husband. A mainstream historical fact. During the Middle Ages, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made confession mandatory for Christians at least once a year. That meant priests suddenly had access to everyone's most intimate thoughts. For women, especially married women, this created a double edge. On one hand, confessing was salvation. On the other, it was surveillance. Priests could share suspicions with husbands, or worse, with inquisitors. Suddenly the words spoken in trust became shackles. And then there were the inquisitors themselves. On the fringes of history, records reveal interrogations that blurred the line between confession and coercion. A woman accused of adultery might be asked leading questions. Did you lie with him? Did you harbor lust? Did you fail to resist temptation? Say no too firmly, and you were obstinate. Say yes, even under pressure, and you sealed your fate. It was less about truth than about forcing a story that matched the accusation. Historians still argue whether confessors truly believed they were saving souls or whether they wielded confession as a convenient way to police women's behavior. Was the priest acting out of genuine faith, or was he merely another cog in a system designed to control? The debate continues, but what remains certain is that the confessional booth was never neutral ground. Imagine the sensory details, the stale smell of incense clinging to the air, the scratch of your knees against the wood, the priest's voice, low but sharp, slicing through your whispered words. Behind the screen, his silhouette is faceless, yet his power over you feels immense. When you rise to leave, you don't feel lighter. You feel watched, because now someone else carries your secrets, and you don't know when or how he'll release them. And if you think priests always kept their silence, think again. There are stories, half hidden in chronicles, of confessors hinting at a wife's waywardness to her husband, often in exchange for favor or influence. Sometimes the suggestion was enough. A husband might storm home and accuse his wife, never needing real evidence beyond the priest's insinuation. The cruel irony is that confession, meant to cleanse the soul, often dirtied reputations. Women who admitted even small doubts about their fidelity risked being seen as already guilty. Better, some decided, to lie in confession than to tell the truth. But of course, lying was also a sin. See the trap? Whether honest or deceptive, women found themselves tangled in a web where every word carried danger. You leave the chapel in your imagination, stepping back into the cold night. The bells toll softly above, marking the hour, but instead of comfort, the sound feels like judgment, echoing in the dark. Once again, you realize that for women accused of infidelity, there was no safe space. Not the marketplace, not the home, and not even the confessional where salvation was promised. Every whisper, every prayer, every word could be turned against them. And in that silence after the bells fade, you feel the weight of all those voices that once carried secrets out of the shadows and into the court of suspicion. You drift from the chapel's shadow doorway into another kind of hall, brighter and filled with velvet and laughter. At first it seems welcoming, the court of love, a place where noblemen and women gathered to debate matters of romance, courtesy, and fidelity. But soon you realize this stage too had teeth. The question wasn't whether love was pure or true, it was whether a woman could survive the judgment dressed up as poetry and play. Ever wondered what it felt like to have your private life turned into a parlor game? Imagine being seated before an audience of nobles, your words weighed like jewels on a merchant's scale. You're asked, if a woman shares a kiss with another man, is she already unfaithful? The crowd leans in, eager, wine goblets clinking. You hesitate, knowing that whichever answer you give might become an arrow pointing back at you. A mainstream historical fact. In 12th century France, Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne are recorded as having presided over such courts of love. Noblewomen debated fidelity and chivalry, often in mock trial style, while troubadours recited verses and knights defended ideals. On paper, it sounded elegant. In reality, these debates sometimes carried real consequences. A woman accused of straying could see her name publicly tarnished under the guise of witty entertainment. And here's a quirky tidbit. Records claim one ruling declared that true love cannot exist within marriage, for it is duty, not freedom. Imagine being a queen hearing that line while already under pressure to produce heirs. The irony is sharp enough to cut glass. Love was celebrated in song but condemned in practice. Historians still argue whether these courts were genuine judicial bodies or simply literary salons. Were they playful exercises in rhetoric or sly instruments to reinforce who was loyal and who was suspect? The debate remains unresolved, but for women caught in the middle, the effect was the same. Public scrutiny dressed in velvet robes. Picture yourself in one of these halls. Tapestries hang heavy with scenes of knights jousting, and the smell of spiced wine lingers in the air. A troubadour plucks his lute, his song floating above the chatter. Then your name is spoken. A ripple runs through the room. Suddenly your laugh at a feast last week, or the way you leaned in too closely to hear a knight's tale, becomes material for debate. Voices weigh in, clever phrases are tossed around, and you sit frozen as your reputation is sliced apart with rhymes and riddles. The cruel irony? Men's indiscretions rarely came under such scrutiny. A knight boasting of conquests was celebrated, while a woman defending her innocence risked ridicule for even speaking. You probably wouldn't enjoy having your entire reputation turned into a medieval comedy sketch, but for many women that was the reality. Sometimes the games turned darker still. A husband seeking to disgrace his wife might arrange for her to be mocked in these debates, securing a veneer of legitimacy for accusations he already intended to press. The crowd, entertained, seldom questioned whether the accusations had substance. They only wanted the spectacle. As the evening wears on in your imagination, the torches gutter low and the nobles drift back to their chambers, leaving behind laughter that feels sour. The words spoken can't be unsaid, and the reputation shredded in jest won't mend. And so, even in courts of supposed refinement, women accused of infidelity faced a new kind of trial, one where sharp tongues and clever rhymes became weapons as deadly as any blade. The velvet-curtained halls fade from view now, replaced by the sharp smell of metal and the hiss of iron heating over coals. What began as whispers, glances, or playful debates often ended here, with marks burned directly into the body. You're standing in a dim chamber where the only light comes from the glow of a brand in the fire. This is the world of the branded adulteress, where punishment meant leaving scars that no cloak could hide. Ever wondered what it felt like to be turned into a permanent warning sign? Imagine kneeling, your hands bound, as officials approach with an iron rod, its end shaped into letters or symbols. Perhaps an A for adulteress, or a crude design meant to signal disgrace. The heat radiates toward you before it even touches your skin, and when it finally does, searing into flesh, the crowd watching doesn't flinch. They lean closer, because in this world, pain was never just personal, it was theatre. A mainstream historical fact in parts of early modern Europe, particularly France and Germany, branding was used to punish women convicted of adultery. The forehead, cheek, or shoulder might be permanently scarred, ensuring that wherever the woman went, her guilt travelled with her. The mark was supposed to speak louder than words, a lifetime stigma impossible to erase. On the fringes of history, you find stranger accounts still. Some chronicles mention women branded not with letters but with animal shapes, a hare or goat, symbols mocking them as lustful creatures. Others describe punishments where hot irons were pressed briefly to the lips under the grotesque reasoning that a mouth used for deceit or forbidden kisses must be silenced by fire. It's the kind of logic you'd expect from someone who thinks torture doubles as poetry. Historians still argue whether branding was common practice or relatively rare, since many records come from sensational accounts rather than court ledgers. But even if not widespread, the very existence of such punishments reveals how seriously societies treated accusations of infidelity. To scar a face was to scar a soul, or at least that's how communities justified it. Imagine the sensory details, the crackle of fire, the metallic tang in the air, the faint screams that echo long after the iron is pulled away. And then imagine the aftermath. A woman branded on the face could not step into a market, a church, or even her own home without her punishment glaring back at everyone who saw her. Unlike gossip, which might fade, a brand never did. It was shame fused to flesh. The cruel irony? Men almost never suffered the same fate. A man caught in adultery might pay a fine or endure a scolding, but his body remained intact. For women, however, their very skin was transformed into a public billboard of disgrace. You probably wouldn't want your private life turned into a permanent tattoo of humiliation, yet countless women had no choice. And consider the psychological weight. Even if a woman was later pardoned or reconciled with her husband, the mark remained. Every time she caught sight of herself in polished metal or water, she would see the accusation staring back. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a life sentence, one that denied the possibility of starting over. You take a step back in your imagination, away from the heat of the iron, and the chamber grows darker, quieter. The branded adulteress disappears into the shadows, but the smell of scorched skin lingers, and you realize with a chill that for many women, survival itself meant carrying shame carved into their bodies for all the world to see. The chamber fades, but the air remains heavy, thick with suspicion. Now the glow of the branding iron gives way to another kind of fire, the flames of witch trials. Because in many places, accusations of infidelity weren't just about betrayal, they bled into accusations of witchcraft. You find yourself standing in a crowded courtroom, the benches packed, the smell of sweat, fear, and candle wax clinging to the air. A woman trembles in the center, and you realize her alleged adultery has been rebranded as sorcery. Ever wondered why women's sexuality and witchcraft became so entangled? It wasn't just random superstition. In the minds of many medieval and early modern Europeans, lust was seen as dangerous, uncontrollable, even demonic. If a woman strayed from her husband, it was easier to say she'd been bewitched, or worse, that she herself was the witch, luring men into sin. A mainstream historical fact. In the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, the witch-hunting manual written by Heinrich Kramer, women were explicitly described as more prone to witchcraft because they were supposedly weaker in faith and more carnal in nature. The text even linked infidelity with sorcery, claiming that adulterous women often used magic to seduce men or conceal their affairs. Imagine that. your alleged crime of the heart transformed into a pact with the devil. And here's a fringe tidbit. In some villages, women accused of cheating were said to have cast love spells using bizarre ingredients, powdered bones, frog hearts, even menstrual blood mixed into food. These stories spread like wildfire, not because they were true, but because they made sense in a world that feared women's hidden power. The weirder the claim, the more believable it seemed to the crowd. Historians still argue whether witch trials were primarily about religion, misogyny, or simple community politics. Was it fear of Satan that drove the accusations, or fear of women stepping outside strict boundaries? Likely, it was a tangled web of all three. But what remains clear is that women accused of infidelity often found themselves dragged into the broader hysteria of witch hunts, where every rumor became supernatural. You picture the scene in your imagination. A woman's neighbor testifies she saw her sneaking out at night. Another swears she found strange herbs in her home. A third insists the cows stopped giving milk after she looked at them. Each evidence is piles higher, until the line between adultery and sorcery dissolves completely. What begins as a suspicion of marital betrayal becomes a death sentence cloaked in theology. The cruel irony: men's infidelities were rarely reimagined as sorcery. A wandering husband might be scolded, perhaps fined, but no one claimed he had made a pact with the devil. Women, on the other hand, were believed to wield dark power simply by existing outside the line society had drawn for them. You probably wouldn't want your late-night walk turned into evidence that you conjure demons, but that was the reality for countless women. And the punishments? They could be as grim as the branding iron, if not worse. Burning at the stake, drowning in rivers, hanging from gallows, executions designed not only to kill, but to cleanse the community of imagined evil. A woman accused of infidelity might end not with shame in the square, but in flames before a crowd that cheered as if they were watching justice. The courtroom fades in your mind, but the echoes linger, the chants of witch, the crackle of fire, the cries of the condemned. And you realize how dangerously easy it was for accusations of infidelity to merge with the great paranoia of witchcraft, creating a trap no woman could escape. The smoke of the witch trial bonfires drifts away in your imagination, and soon you're walking through the quieter interior of a home, stone floors, wooden beams, the faint creak of a door in the wind. But don't be fooled by the silence. This is the world where the husband's word was law, and his accusation alone could be enough to destroy a woman. Ever wondered what it felt like to live with someone who held not only the keys to your household, but also to your fate? In medieval and early modern societies, a husband's authority wasn't just domestic, it was legal. His word carried weight in courts, and if he claimed his wife was unfaithful, that claim alone often started a process that could not easily be stopped. A mainstream historical fact: under Roman law, which influenced much of Europe, the principle of paterfamilias gave the male head of household immense power. He could discipline, expel, or in extreme cases even kill members of his household with limited repercussions. This legacy trickled down into later legal codes, where a husband's testimony about his wife's behavior was treated with near automatic credibility. On the fringes of history, you find disturbing details. In some parts of early modern Russia, men were permitted to beat their wives if they suspected infidelity, no evidence required. In other places, including certain Italian city-states, honor killings were quietly tolerated, where a husband who murdered an allegedly unfaithful wife faced little or no punishment. It's as if society gave him a grim nod of approval for defending his pride. Historians still argue whether these allowances were written explicitly into law or were simply cultural norms overlooked by courts. Was it law endorsing male dominance, or courts turning a blind eye to what everyone considered acceptable? Either way, the effect was the same. Women lived with the knowledge that their husband's words could decide their destiny. Picture it. You're in a candlelit chamber, the heavy curtains drawn. Your husband storms in, his face red, his voice raised. He claims you've been unfaithful, And though you deny it, you see the look in his eyes. He doesn't need proof. Tomorrow he'll tell the magistrate. And when he does, the magistrate will likely believe him, not you. The marriage bed becomes both the origin of suspicion and the evidence itself. The cruel irony? A man could carry on with mistresses openly, and his wife's word against him meant little. But if she even appeared guilty, her silence could be twisted into confession, and her husband's testimony sealed the matter. You probably wouldn't want your fate hanging entirely on the moods and suspicions of the person you share a bed with, yet countless women lived under that constant threat. Some tried to fight back. There are rare records of women counter-accusing their husbands, claiming abuse or neglect. But in courts dominated by men, these counters rarely succeeded. The wife's credibility was always overshadowed by her husband's status. You step out of the chamber in your mind onto the narrow lane beyond the house, but even here you feel it, that looming power imbalance. It wasn't just the gossiping crowd, the priests, or the inquisitors. It was the man in the home, the one society trusted above all, whose single word could drag a woman from safety into ruin. And with that realization, the silence of the house doesn't feel safe at all. It feels like the heaviest silence of all, the silence where one accusation, whispered in anger, could bring everything crashing down. You leave the narrow lane behind and find yourself walking into a palace chamber draped in velvet, perfumed with incense, but heavy with unease. Here, suspicion is not whispered, but embroidered with gold thread, because when queens were accused, the stories never stayed simple. Poison, plots, and paranoia turned allegations of infidelity into tales of murder and treason. Ever wondered why so many royal scandals read like crime novels? Imagine a king who begins to suspect his wife. It isn't enough to say she might have looked fondly at another man. No, the rumor grows fangs. Suddenly she is accused of slipping poison into goblets, conspiring with lovers to murder her husband, or plotting treason with foreign courts. The bedchamber transforms into a battlefield where suspicion seeps into every cup of wine, every bite of food. A mainstream historical fact, Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was accused not only of past indiscretions, but of ongoing infidelity. When her alleged affairs came to light, the accusations quickly escalated. She was portrayed as reckless, dangerous, even treasonous. The court painted her not just as an unfaithful wife, but as a threat to the kingdom's stability. Her execution was staged as both a punishment for adultery and a safeguard against supposed political plots. On the fringes of history, you find strange stories of queens accused of dabbling with potions and charms. In 16th century France, rumors swirled around Catherine de' Medici, linking her to dark arts and poisons, largely because she was Italian, foreign, and powerful. Some claimed she passed love filters and deadly brews among courtiers, blurring the line between infidelity, witchcraft, and assassination. Were these accusations true? Likely not. But they reveal how quickly suspicion of betrayal could morph into accusations of sinister plots. Historians still argue whether these stories were believed by the public or merely convenient tools for political rivals. Was Catherine Howard truly guilty, or was she sacrificed to clear the way for a new queen? Was Catherine de' Medici really a poisoner, or was she a victim of xenophobia and fear? The debates rage on, but the effect in their lifetimes was the same. Suspicion swelled into paranoia, and paranoia demanded blood. You imagine the scene. A queen sits at a long banquet table, jeweled goblet in hand. The hall glitters with candlelight, yet every eye is on her. A rumor whispers that her drink is poisoned, or that she shares secret letters with a lover across the hall. Every movement she makes, sipping wine, speaking too softly, becomes fuel for the fire. Her very presence is reinterpreted as evidence against her. And here lies the cruel irony. The king's own excesses often fed these suspicions. If he grew ill, if he lost vigor, it was convenient to claim that his queen had poisoned him. You probably wouldn't want your spouse's indigestion turned into proof of your guilt, but for queens, it was a risk every meal carried. The paranoia could be suffocating. Queens were surrounded by attendants, yet always alone, knowing that any slip, a note, a smile, a confidant's betrayal, might be seized upon and spun into tales of adultery laced with poison. Their bodies and reputations weren't just at risk. Their very lives hung in the balance, balanced on the sharp edge of rumour sharpened into treason. You leave the glittering hall in your imagination, but the taste of bitterness lingers as though you'd sipped from that same goblet. Poison, whether real or metaphorical, was never far from the accusations. And paranoia, royal paranoia, ensured that queens accused of infidelity rarely fell alone. Their names were entwined with plots, scandals, and the slow, choking fear that every glance, every drink, might be their last. You step away from the banquet hall now, the imagined goblets and jewelled daggers fading, and find yourself in a dark chamber, lit only by a single torch. Against the wall hangs a curious device, a belt of iron, studded with locks and hinges. Its very presence makes you uneasy. This is the myth, and sometimes the reality, of the chastity belt, an object that for centuries became a symbol of how societies tried to police women's fidelity. Ever wondered whether those medieval contraptions really existed the way legends claim? You've probably seen them in films or cartoons, a clunky iron girdle with a padlock, supposedly fastened to a wife before her husband went off to war. The story goes that it guaranteed her loyalty, since no one could possibly gain access. But here's the twist. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were widely used or whether most of them were elaborate jokes, later hoaxes, or even cruel museum fakes. A mainstream historical fact: while some surviving metal devices labelled as chastity belts exist in museums today, most date from the 18th and 19th centuries, not the Middle Ages. Many were likely created as curiosities or to satisfy Victorian obsessions with sexual morality, rather than as real tools of control in medieval households. Still, the very idea of them seeped into cultural memory, reinforcing the image of women's bodies as locked property. On the fringe, though, there are accounts suggesting that makeshift versions may have existed. Some chronicles describe cloth or leather contraptions fastened with seals, more symbolic than practical, given to women as pledges of loyalty. Others hint at noblemen who may have commissioned bizarre iron versions, whether for real use or for intimidation. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales reveal how fear of infidelity often birthed strange inventions. You picture the torchlight glinting on iron, casting grotesque shadows across the wall. Imagine being forced to wear such a device, cold, heavy, humiliating. Even if never actually locked, the threat of it hanging on the wall would send a chilling message. Your body is not yours. And worse, the key would rest in your husband's pocket, a reminder that your freedom itself was under lock and guard. Historians still argue whether the chastity belt myth says more about the Middle Ages or about the centuries that came after. Did it reflect genuine medieval practices, or was it a later invention, a cruel fantasy cooked up by men fascinated with controlling female sexuality? The debate remains open, but what cannot be denied is how enduring the image has been. Even today, people hear chastity belt and imagine knights and castles as though women really lived under clinking iron locks. The cruel irony. Men's fidelity was rarely questioned. No one dreamed of locking up husbands before they rode off to war. The double standard clangs louder than any chain. You probably wouldn't want to wear a metal cage to reassure someone else of your loyalty. Yet countless women throughout history were haunted by the possibility of it, whether in rumor, threat, or reality. As you step back from the chamber in your imagination, the iron belt seems to glare in the shadows like a cruel joke turned deadly serious. Whether myth, hoax, or rare reality, the chastity belt remains one of history's most enduring symbols of suspicion, the belief that a woman's fidelity must be sealed, locked, and owned. You turn away from the iron glint of the so-called chastity belt and find yourself walking down a long corridor. The air grows cooler, quieter, until at last you arrive at a heavy wooden door bound with iron hinges. It creaks open slowly, revealing not a dungeon, but a cloister. Rows of narrow windows filter pale light into the stone passage. and the faint sound of chanting drifts from somewhere beyond. This is where many women accused of infidelity ended their lives, not in flames or shame in the market, but in the silent walls of convents. Ever wondered what it felt like to be buried alive without ever dying? For women accused of betrayal, exile into a convent was a punishment disguised as piety. A husband, unable or unwilling to execute his wife, could instead arrange for her to be cloistered. On the surface, it looked merciful. She wasn't killed, merely retired into religious life. But in reality, it was social death, a lifetime of isolation behind cold stone. A mainstream historical fact. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, convents often served as dumping grounds for unwanted wives, daughters, and sisters. Noble families sometimes forced women to take the veil against their will, using accusations of misconduct, or simply the need to save face, as justification. These women were written out of family histories, their lives erased behind barred windows. On the fringes of history, you find haunting tales of lovers who followed. In some regions, if a woman was accused of infidelity with a specific man, both might be forced into monastic life, she into a convent, he into a monastery. They were technically still alive, but forever separated. One legend even tells of lovers communicating across cloister walls by tapping on stones in coded rhythms, their voices silenced but their longing still pulsing through stone. Historians still argue whether convent confinement was always meant as punishment or sometimes disguised as protection. Was it a husband's way of saving a wife from harsher penalties, or simply a tidier method of erasing her? The truth likely lies in both, mercy for some, cruelty for most. Picture it in your imagination. A woman kneels in the chapel, her fine gowns exchanged for coarse wool habits, her jewels sold to fund her keep. The air smells of candle wax and damp stone. Beyond the walls, feasts and hunts and courtly dances continue, but she will never see them again. Her days now stretch endlessly in prayer, silence, and the cold rhythm of bells. And here lies the cruel irony. While the convent was supposed to represent closeness to God, for many women it was nothing more than exile disguised as holiness. She hadn't chosen the veil, it had been chosen for her, pressed onto her head as firmly as an executioner's blade. You probably wouldn't want your life rewritten as a nun's punishment for a crime you didn't commit, yet countless women endured exactly that fate. Sometimes, years later, whispers of their existence would surface. She is still alive in the cloister, pale and silent. But for their families, these women were already dead, their names struck from inheritance rolls, their voices gone from family councils. As you walk the cloister in your mind, the echo of chanting surrounds you, steady, endless, almost hypnotic. But instead of peace, it feels like mourning. These deserted lovers, locked behind convent walls, became shadows, living reminders of how society preferred silence over scandal. The cloister fades behind you, its echoing chants swallowed by the sound of a crowd gathering. The murmur swells, footsteps shuffle, and soon you're standing in the open air of a public square once again. But this time, it's not humiliation or confinement on display. This is execution as theatre, where accusations of infidelity culminated not just in punishment, but in carefully staged performances of death. Ever wondered why executions drew such enormous audiences? They weren't only about justice, they were about spectacle. When a woman accused of betraying her husband was sentenced, her death became a lesson, a grim drama meant to confirm social order. You picture the scaffold rising above the crowd, the wood rough underfoot, ropes creaking, and guards keeping the eager masses back. A mainstream historical fact, Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 was attended by thousands. Her alleged affairs, spun into treasonous plots, turned her death into both royal theatre and political necessity. The French swordsman brought in to perform the beheading gave the scene an almost ceremonial air, as though the Queen's destruction needed to be both precise and spectacular. And it worked. Her execution was not just about ending her life, it was about warning every woman and every man what happens when loyalty is questioned. On the fringes of history, you find smaller but no less theatrical punishments. In some German towns, women accused of adultery were drowned in cages lowered into rivers, the crowd cheering as bubbles broke the surface. In other places, condemned women were forced to march through city gates with signs proclaiming their crime before being stoned or hanged. Each act was not only about killing the accused, it was about satisfying the community's hunger for drama. Historians still argue whether these executions genuinely reinforced moral order or simply provided macabre entertainment. Was the death meant to scare others into fidelity, or was it a morbid carnival dressed up as righteousness? The debates linger, but the blood-soaked stages suggest both. Picture it vividly, the crowd's anticipation, children perched on shoulders, merchants closing stalls to watch, the air thick with roasting meat from vendors who treated executions like festivals. You stand among them, and the noise swells as the condemned woman climbs the scaffold. Her hair is bound back, her hands tied. She glances once at the sky, perhaps whispering a prayer, and then the final act begins. The blade falls, or the rope tightens, or the waters close above her head, and the crowd exhales in one collective sound as though satisfied by the ending of a play. The cruel irony? Men accused of infidelity rarely faced such spectacle. A nobleman might lose some property or endure a stern sermon, but his head did not roll before thousands. You probably wouldn't enjoy knowing your life could end not only in violence, but in front of an audience that treated your final moments as entertainment. Yet for many women that was the ultimate fate, death as performance, shame as a public feast. And when the stage was cleared, the crowd drifted away, leaving behind only silence, bloodstains, and a memory that reinforced the lesson. Women's lives could be destroyed in the name of order, and their deaths consumed as theatre. The scaffold fades, but the roar of the crowd lingers in your ears like a stubborn echo. You walk on, and soon you find yourself in a quieter chamber, a study lined with books and scrolls. Here, words carry weight too, but instead of cheering mobs, it's ink and parchment that expose the ugliest truth of all, the double standard. Ever wondered how blatantly unequal the rules were? For men, affairs were a tolerated indulgence, even celebrated. A king could keep mistresses in plain sight, filling castles with illegitimate children, and courtiers would applaud his virility. But a woman, even a queen, could be ruined by the faintest suggestion of disloyalty. Fidelity wasn't about morality, it was about property and control. A mainstream historical fact, Charles II of England openly acknowledged more than a dozen illegitimate children by various mistresses. His court adored these women, showering them with wealth and titles. But Charles's queen, Catherine of Braganza, faced humiliation when she failed to produce an heir. Though no one proved she was unfaithful, her barrenness alone fueled whispers. She endured ridicule while her husband's lovers were celebrated as celebrities of their day. On the fringes of history, you find accounts almost laughable in their hypocrisy. In some Italian city-states, men could legally keep concubines while women could be executed for merely being suspected of straying. One case tells of a nobleman who brought his mistress to live in the same house as his wife, and when the wife complained, she was accused of jealousy and disobedience, a crime in itself. You probably wouldn't want your indignation at betrayal turned into proof of your guilt, yet that was exactly how the rules worked. Historians still argue whether societies truly believed women's sexuality was inherently more dangerous, or whether it was simply convenient to police women more strictly. Was it ideology or opportunism? Either way, the ink on the laws made the bias official. Imagine the scene. You're a noblewoman attending a court feast. Across the hall, men boast openly of their mistresses, swapping bawdy jokes that make everyone laugh. You force a smile, but you know that if you even exchange a private word with another man, your reputation will be shredded by morning. The same behavior that makes a man charming makes a woman damned. The cruel irony? Women were often blamed for men's affairs too. A husband caught straying could accuse his wife of driving him to it through coldness or disobedience. It was a double bind. If you were affectionate, you risked suspicion of impropriety. If you were distant, you risked being accused of pushing your husband into another's arms. You simply couldn't win. And it wasn't just nobles. In peasant villages, too, a man's affair might be excused as natural appetite, while a woman's was painted as sin against God and family. Even plays and ballads reinforced the divide. Men were portrayed as lovable rogues, women as dangerous betrayers. You wander deeper into the imagined study, the shelves heavy with dusty tomes. Each spine seems to whisper the same story. The rules of fidelity were never equal. For men, they were flexible, bendable, laughable. For women, they were steel chains, and breaking them, or being accused of breaking them, meant ruin. As you turn away from the shelves, you feel the weight of the hypocrisy pressing down. In every hall, every village, every law book, the double standard stood like a fortress, and women accused of infidelity had to fight battles they could never truly win. The dusty study fades, and in your imagination you find yourself seated at a writing desk, quill in hand, parchment spread before you. Outside the window, the night air hums with crickets, but inside, the silence is taut with danger. Here lies one of the most treacherous forms of evidence a woman could face: coded letters, secret notes, or love tokens that could turn whispers into damning proof. Ever wondered how a simple scrap of paper could condemn a life? Picture this: a folded letter tucked into a sleeve, exchanged with trembling hands at a feast. It might contain only a poem, a riddle, or a harmless line of courtesy, but once discovered, it became a weapon. Husbands, servants, and rivals rifled through letters like spies, eager to catch the faintest trace of impropriety. A woman's own handwriting could become the rope that strangled her. A mainstream historical fact: Anne Boleyn, before her fall, was accused in part through alleged correspondence with men at court. Though much of the evidence was questionable, even the idea that she exchanged written words privately with someone other than her husband was painted as scandalous. In a world where women's voices were already mistrusted, their written words carried double suspicion. On the fringes of history, the stories grow stranger. Some records speak of women accused because they owned certain books of poetry, especially courtly love poems, which were seen as invitations to secret affairs. In a few cases, pressed flowers found between pages of a psalter or ribbon hidden in a drawer were presented in court as tokens of betrayal. Imagine being condemned because of a bookmark. You probably wouldn't want your reading habits turned into evidence of treason, but that was reality for many women. Historians still argue how often these letters were genuine love notes, and how often they were forged by rivals or interpolated by accusers. Did a queen really slip a coded message to a knight, or did someone create one after her fall was already assured? The truth is blurred, and the surviving scraps of paper are stained more with politics than with passion. Imagine the sensory details: the scratch of a quill on parchment, the faint scent of wax as a seal is pressed, the quickened breath of a servant slipping the letter into the wrong hands. Then the moment of discovery, an attendant opening a chest, pulling out folded paper, gasping with delight or horror. By the time the note reached the court, its meaning was no longer hers to define. It became a confession she never wrote. The cruel irony: men could write thousands of bawdy verses or boastful love poems, and they were praised as gallant. But a woman's single line of verse, even to a cousin or friend, could ruin her. Her words were not celebrated as art, they were dissected as evidence. And so the desk before you in your imagination doesn't feel safe. The inkpot, the quill, the folded parchment, each carries the threat of betrayal. Letters of love meant to preserve tenderness, too often preserved suspicion instead. And for women accused of infidelity, every line of ink became another link in the chain tightening around their fate. The writing desk fades, parchment curling into shadow, and you find yourself entering a grand hall once again. But this one feels different. Its banners hang heavy with foreign crests, its courtiers speaking in accents that sound strange to local ears. Here, queens who came from distant lands often discovered that their foreign blood carried suspicion before they ever spoke. For outsider wives, accusations of infidelity were almost inevitable. Ever wondered how quickly difference can turn into danger? Imagine being a young woman sent across seas or mountains to marry a king you barely know. You step into a court where everyone eyes you with curiosity, some with hostility. Your clothes, your language, even your manners seem unusual. And when heirs fail to appear, or when politics grow tense, whispers begin. She's too close to her foreign attendants, perhaps too close to that ambassador. Your very otherness becomes the evidence, a mainstream historical fact. Catherine of Aragon, though beloved at first, was a Spanish princess in an English court that never fully trusted her. Later, when Henry VIII sought to rid himself of her, he leaned on claims that their marriage was cursed and hinted at impropriety in her past. Though he lacked evidence, her foreignness made it easier for some courtiers to accept the narrative that she was somehow unfit or disloyal. On the fringes of history, the accusations grew more colourful. Marie Antoinette, Austrian Queen of France, was not only accused of infidelity but of scandalous liaisons with multiple men and even women at court. Pamphlets of the time painted her as a predator, each rumour more lurid than the last. Were they true? Almost certainly not. But as a foreign queen, every move she made was magnified. Her accent, her friendships, her extravagance, all were cast as proof of a dangerous sexuality. Historians still argue whether foreign queens were targeted more for their loyalties or their fertility. Were they suspected because they were outsiders who might betray the realm, or because they represented convenient scapegoats when dynastic hopes faltered? Likely both. But the fact remains, their status as other painted them as guilty before trials even began. Picture it in your imagination, a queen seated on a throne, her jewels gleaming under candlelight. Around her, courtiers whisper in languages she barely understands. She leans closer to a trusted countryman, someone who shares her tongue, and immediately, eyes narrow. The simple comfort of speaking her native words is reinterpreted as secret plotting or worse, as flirtation. By morning, rumours will have grown claws, the cruel irony. These foreign queens were often brought in precisely to secure alliances and strengthen kingdoms. Yet the very thing that made them valuable, their ties to other lands, made them suspect. You probably wouldn't want your birthplace turned into evidence of betrayal, yet countless women faced exactly that trap. And sometimes the accusations went beyond the queens themselves. Their ladies-in-waiting, often foreigners too, were painted as accomplices in scandal. Whole entourages were dismissed or disgraced under the shadow of suspicion. It wasn't just the queen who suffered, it was everyone tethered to her. As you leave the hall in your imagination, the murmurs follow you. Foreign queens, foreign suspicions, they echo down centuries, reminders that difference alone could brand a woman unfaithful long before she ever had a chance to prove otherwise. The foreign banners fade from your mind, and now you wander into a quieter chamber, a small council room where men lean over parchment, whispering in low tones. The air is thick, not with incense or smoke, but with slander. This is where accusations often began, not in the bedroom itself, but in words sharpened into weapons. Tonight, you trace the anatomy of slander, how a single insult could unravel lives and even topple dynasties. Ever wondered how fragile a reputation could be when honor was the currency of survival? Imagine someone calling you whore in a crowded market. Today, you might shout back, maybe sue, maybe shrug it off. But in the medieval or early modern world, that word wasn't just rude, it was dynamite. It could mean loss of dowry, annulment of marriage, or disinheritance of children. It could mark you in one breath as unfit to stand in church, unworthy of your husband, and unclean in God's eyes. A mainstream historical fact, slander cases fill the court records of early modern Europe. In England, for instance, women often brought defamation suits against neighbours who accused them of adultery. The very frequency of these suits shows how powerful words could be. Accusations of unchastity weren't just insults, they were social and legal weapons that could destroy entire households. On the fringes of history, some slanders became legendary. In 15th century France, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was accused in bawdy poems of sleeping with her own son. The claim was grotesque and baseless, but it spread so widely that it still lingers in chronicles today. Another example, Anne of Austria, Queen of France in the 17th century, was slandered with rumours that her children weren't fathered by Louis XIII at all, but by Cardinal Mazarin. Whether whispered in taverns or printed in pamphlets, slander reached every corner of society, staining reputations beyond repair. Historians still argue whether slander was primarily about controlling women's sexuality or simply a political tool to weaken rivals. Was Isabeau maligned because she was a foreign queen in troubled times, or because attacking a queen's fidelity was the quickest way to attack the dynasty itself? Either way, the words stuck, and centuries later, historians are still sifting fact from venom. You picture it in your imagination, a courtier leaning close to another, muttering, "She's unfaithful, you know." The words travel like sparks on dry straw. By the next day, a servant repeats them in the kitchen. By the end of the week, a pamphlet prints the rumour in crude woodcut illustrations. Soon the entire city hums with the story, and whether true or not, it becomes a kind of truth in itself. The cruel irony? Once slander spread, no amount of denial could erase it. Silence looked like guilt. Anger looked like guilt. Even protestations of innocence fed the flames. You probably wouldn't want your entire life judged by how loudly you defended yourself against a lie, yet countless women lived under that no-win scenario. And slander didn't just target queens or nobles. In small villages too, women who were seen as too independent or outspoken were often labelled adulteress or whore. The insult alone could isolate them, drive them into poverty, or invite harsher accusations like witchcraft. As you leave the chamber in your mind, the whispers follow. A single insult echoes louder than the truth, and slander's anatomy is simple but devastating. One sharp word, repeated often enough, could cut deeper than any blade. The chamber of whispers fades, and you step into a house. Not a palace this time, but a simple home. The walls are close, the hearth burns low, and the windows are shuttered tight. Yet the silence here feels heavier than in any courtroom, because for many women accused of infidelity, punishment wasn't public at all. It was private, hidden, enforced not by judges or priests, but by their own husbands. Welcome to the silent prisons of the home. Ever wondered what it felt like to be locked away in your own house? Not a dungeon, not a convent, but the very rooms where you once laughed, cooked, raised children. Many women accused of betrayal found themselves trapped behind doors, bolted from the outside, reduced to shadows within their own walls. For the neighbours, life looked normal. For the women, it was a slow kind of erasure, a mainstream historical fact. In many parts of Europe, particularly in the early modern period, husbands were legally permitted to restrain wives they suspected of infidelity. Sometimes this meant temporary confinement, but in practice it could stretch on for years. The law gave men authority to discipline wives, a vague term that too often meant imprisonment inside the home. On the fringes of history, stories emerge of makeshift cells built into houses, tiny chambers or attics where women were kept out of sight. One grim tale from Italy speaks of a nobleman who bricked his wife into a small room after accusing her of betrayal, feeding her through a hole in the wall. Was it true? Historians debate whether the account was exaggerated, but even as rumour, it reveals how easily suspicion slid into cruelty. Historians still argue whether such confinements were common practice or exceptional extremes. Were most accused women quietly locked away, or did only the wealthiest families build such private prisons? The records are inconsistent, but the stories that remain suggest that countless women vanished into their own homes, never to emerge again. Picture it in your imagination, the creak of the floorboards above, as the household carries on, servants cooking, children playing, while a woman sits alone in a locked chamber, hearing life continue without her. The hearth's warmth never reaches her room. Her meals arrive cold, shoved under a door. She has no court to appeal to, no audience to plead before. She is both prisoner and ghost, erased but not gone. The cruel irony. To the outside world, the family remained intact. The husband could attend feasts, laugh with neighbors, even remarry if rumors of his wife's illness spread widely enough. Meanwhile, the woman lived like a shadow in her own home, punished not by law but by silence. You probably wouldn't want your own kitchen turned into a cage, yet many women faced exactly that fate. And sometimes their confinement outlasted the suspicion itself. Even if the husband later softened or doubts faded, the stigma remained. Who would welcome back a woman once accused? Who would believe her innocence after years of silence? The prison wasn't just the locked door, it was the memory of accusation that clung to her forever. As you leave the house in your imagination, the walls seem to close in, and you realize that prisons didn't always stand apart from society. Sometimes they were built right into the heart of the home, where suspicion turned safety into a cage and silence into the cruelest punishment of all. The quiet house dissolves in your imagination, and you step into a vaulted hall lined with books and scrolls. Candles burn low on wooden tables, their wax pooling slowly, while cloaked figures lean over texts, debating fiercely. This is not a court or a market, but a place of learning, where philosophers, theologians, and scholars argued about fidelity, loyalty, and whether women could ever truly be trusted. Tonight, you're in the middle of the philosopher's dilemma. Ever wondered what it felt like to have your worth debated by men who had never lived your life? Imagine sitting silently while learned men in flowing robes weigh your very soul, deciding whether women are naturally inclined to deceit. Their words don't bruise your skin, but they bruise your reputation across centuries. A mainstream historical fact: Aristotle, one of antiquity's most influential thinkers, described women as colder, weaker, and less rational than men, qualities he associated with unreliability. His ideas filtered down through medieval scholastics, shaping how European law and theology treated women. When church fathers later debated marital fidelity, they leaned heavily on this philosophical foundation, reinforcing the belief that women were prone to sin. On the fringes of history, you find peculiar treatises, texts where scholars claimed to detect infidelity through bizarre, scientific means. One medieval medical theory suggested that unfaithful women developed subtle changes in their eyes or pulses. Another argued that a woman's breath could reveal betrayal, as though adultery left a scent. These ideas read like parody now, but they were taken seriously in their time, fueling suspicion and tests that could never be passed. Historians still argue whether these writings reflected genuine belief or were simply tools of control dressed in scholarly robes. Did philosophers really think women's bodies betrayed their secrets, or were such theories convenient ways to rationalize punishment? The truth likely blends both, sincere ignorance and strategic misogyny. Picture it, you sit on a wooden bench in this imagined hall. The scholars debate, their voices rising. One insists women are inherently weaker, more easily tempted. Another, slightly kinder, argues that women can be faithful, but only under constant guidance. Their quills scratch across parchment, sealing arguments that will outlive them by centuries. You can't speak, you can't protest, and even if you did, they'd dismiss your words as emotional, not rational. The cruel irony? These debates, held in libraries and monasteries, spilled into courts and laws. Judges and priests cited philosophers as though quoting scripture. A woman's fate might rest not on evidence, but on Aristotle's ancient words repeated like gospel. You probably wouldn't want your life judged by men arguing over a scroll, yet countless women were condemned by ideas formed in rooms they never entered. And so the philosopher's dilemma was never truly about truth, it was about authority. The scholars asked, can women be faithful? But what they meant was, how can we ensure they remain controlled? The answers they wrote shaped centuries of suspicion, feeding the punishments you've already seen: ordeals, gossip, branding, exile. As you leave the imagined hall, the candle smoke curls upward, carrying with it the voices of long-dead men who never met the women they condemned. Their debates linger like dust, still influencing how history judged every accused woman who followed. The echoes of scholarly debates fade, and in your imagination you find yourself out on a cobbled street at dusk. A crowd gathers not for judgment in a court, but for entertainment. Minstrels tune lutes, ballad sellers shout, and children chase each other between stalls. Here, stories are currency, and tonight those stories take shape in songs. Songs that damned reputations long before any trial. Ever wondered what it felt like to have your name turned into a chorus? Imagine hearing a melody drifting through the square, cheerful and catchy, only to realize the words mock you. A ballad about a faithless wife, set to a jaunty tune, sung by a drunken group in a tavern. The song spreads faster than any edict. You walk past, cheeks burning, knowing that everyone hums your supposed betrayal under their breath. A mainstream historical fact. In early modern England and France at broadside ballads, cheaply printed songs sold for pennies were one of the most popular forms of mass entertainment. Some chronicled scandals of queens and nobles, turning accusations of infidelity into public amusement. One such ballad mocked Queen Anne Boleyn's alleged affairs, while another ridiculed Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles the First, painting her as a schemer with lovers. On the fringes of history, you find even stranger tales. In small villages, local singers often inserted neighbours' names into bawdy songs. Imagine being accused not by a magistrate but by a rhyme shouted in the marketplace. She went to milk the cow but met her lover somehow. Crude, ridiculous, but once sung, impossible to erase. In some cases, these songs spread so widely that they reached courts as evidence, transforming gossip into ink. Historians still argue whether ballads reflected true public opinion or whether they shaped it. Did people sing these songs because they already believed the rumours, or did the songs themselves plant the suspicion? Either way, the power of music was undeniable. A catchy tune could outlast trials, leaving reputations ruined long after the truth was forgotten. Picture it. The smell of roasted chestnuts in the air, the strum of a lute, the sharp laughter of a crowd. The singer's voice rises above the noise, weaving scandal into rhyme. People tap their feet, clap their hands, and laugh as your supposed sins are immortalized in melody. Children repeat the lines, turning cruelty into a game. And when the crowd disperses, the song lingers, stuck in everyone's head like an earworm of shame. The cruel irony. Songs could travel farther than official decrees. A woman acquitted in court might still live under the shadow of a ballad. You probably wouldn't want your innocence drowned out by a tune everyone loves to sing, but for many women that was their fate. And unlike judgments written in dusty ledgers, songs had wings. Sailors carried them to new ports, soldiers sang them on campaign, and suddenly a woman's betrayal was known hundreds of miles away. Her shame became entertainment, replayed in taverns and marketplaces long after her life had ended. As you leave the cobbled street in your imagination, the song continues faintly carried on the evening wind, and you realize how deeply music, supposed to bring joy, was also a weapon, one that turned rumor into immortality. The song drifts away on the wind, but the laughter it leaves behind morphs into something harsher. Mockery sharpened into blades. You wander into a noisy tavern, the air thick with ale and smoke. The benches are crowded with men in rough wool and leather, their voices booming as they trade jokes. But the punchlines tonight are not harmless. They're about women accused of betrayal. Welcome to the cruel jest of comedians. Ever wondered what it felt like to hear your life turned into a punchline? Imagine sitting in the back of a tavern, your hood drawn low, while a jester or minstrel cracks jokes about faithless wives. The room erupts with laughter. They don't know you're there, or maybe they do, but either way, the joke lands squarely on your shoulders. In a world where reputation was survival, being the subject of ridicule was a punishment all its own. A mainstream historical fact. In Elizabethan England, plays performed on public stages often mocked adulterous women as stock characters. They were painted as deceitful, lustful, and ridiculous, usually punished at the end for the audience's satisfaction. Shakespeare himself dabbled in this trope. Think of Othello, where Desdemona's alleged betrayal fuels tragedy. Even when innocent, women on stage were written as the embodiment of suspicion. On the fringes of history, jesters at noble courts often performed bawdy skits, lampooning queens and ladies of rank. Some chroniclers record comedians mocking Queen Margaret of Anjou during the Wars of the Roses, hinting at supposed affairs to undermine her authority. Were these jokes believed, or just tolerated as humour? Historians still argue, but the damage was real. Ridicule blurred into rumour, and rumour blurred into truth. Picture it. The tavern rattles with laughter as a jester struts across a makeshift stage. He mimics a wife sneaking from her bed, the crowd howling at his exaggerated steps. He raises a tankard, declaring, "Better a cuckold than a pauper," and men slap the tables in approval. The women in the audience glance down, silent, because laughing feels like betrayal, and not laughing marks them as suspicious. The cruel irony, men's affairs were also joked about, but as conquests, not crimes. A man's infidelity became a boast, a wink, a source of pride. A woman's supposed betrayal was comedy only because it came with shame. You probably wouldn't want your marriage, or your imagined mistakes, turned into material for a tavern skit, yet countless women had no choice but to endure it. Historians still argue whether humour was a safety valve, an outlet for social tension, or whether it simply reinforced the cruelty of double standards. Perhaps it was both. But what remains clear is that ridicule was another form of punishment, less bloody than the scaffold, but no less cutting. As you leave the tavern in your imagination, the laughter follows you into the night. It's not warm or joyful, it's jagged mocking, a reminder that for women accused of infidelity, even humour could be fatal. The tavern's raucous laughter fades into a softer hush as you step into a gallery filled with paintings, tapestries, and carved stone. The air is still, dust motes swirling in shafts of light, and here the stories of accused women linger in silence, not as jokes or songs, but as hidden pleas woven into art. For some artists, poets, and playwrights, sympathy for women trapped by false charges was expressed not openly, but in coded gestures, brushstrokes, and verses. Ever wondered how resistance can hide in plain sight? Imagine staring at a painting of a biblical scene. Susanna at her bath, harassed by lecherous elders. On the surface, it's a pious reminder of virtue tested by sin. But look closer and you will notice the painter lingers on Susanna's fearful expression, on her isolation, on the cruelty of the men looming over her. For those who knew, it wasn't just a biblical tale, it was a mirror of contemporary women accused unjustly of infidelity. A mainstream historical fact, Renaissance artists repeatedly painted Susanna and the elders, Judith, or other women caught in trials of chastity. Scholars note these works often reflected anxieties about women's fidelity, but they also gave voice to quiet sympathy. Susanna, falsely accused, became a symbol of women trapped by slander. In her painted eyes, audiences saw both beauty and injustice. On the fringes of history, poets and dramatists embedded secret commentary into their works. One French poet of the 16th century wrote verses about caged birds forced to sing for their masters, lines many later interpreted as subtle criticism of how noblewomen were accused and confined. In Spain, some Golden Age plays contained characters who cleverly exposed the hypocrisy of jealous husbands, cloaking social critique in comedy so it could slip past censors. Historians still argue whether these sympathetic portrayals were genuine advocacy or simply artistic fashions. Did artists truly mean to defend women, or did they just find tragedy and injustice compelling subjects for their craft? The debate remains open, but what's certain is that art provided one of the only spaces where women's suffering could be reframed not as sin but as sorrow. Picture it. You stand in front of a painting, candlelight flickering across canvas. A woman's face, pale and wide-eyed, looks directly out, as though pleading for someone, anyone, to believe her. Around her, men gesture accusingly, their hands raised like claws. To most viewers, it's another biblical morality tale. But to those who have lived with suspicion, the message is clear. This is what it feels like to be condemned for something you did not do. The cruel irony. These hidden sympathies rarely saved women in reality. You probably wouldn't want your only defense to be a painted look of pity hanging in a gallery no one in power cared to interpret. But for some, these secret symbols were the only acknowledgement of their suffering that survived. And so, in brushstrokes, verses, and carved stone, the pleas of accused women live on, not in courts or chronicles, but in the hidden layers of art, where the condemned were finally allowed to be seen as human. You leave the gallery behind, the painted eyes of Susanna still following you, and step into the dim interior of an apothecary's shop. The shelves are crowded with jars of herbs, powders, and curious vials, the air pungent with rosemary, myrrh, and something more acrid. Here lies another shadowy chapter of suspicion, love potions, elixirs, and scandalous brews that tied women's reputations to witchcraft, medicine, and desire all at once. Ever wondered how a pinch of dried herb could be twisted into evidence of infidelity? Imagine you buy a packet of crushed rose petals, perhaps to scent your linens or ease a headache. A week later, your husband discovers it and declares it a potion to bewitch men. Suddenly, you're not just a wife, you're a sorceress in disguise. In a world already primed to suspect women, the apothecary's wares became dangerous to touch, a mainstream historical fact. In early modern Europe, herbal remedies and potions were frequently linked to love and lust. Midwives, healers, and even respectable wives kept recipes for philters said to attract or bind affection. Some were harmless blends of wine, honey, and herbs. Others included more alarming ingredients, mandrake root, animal parts, or blood. Courts often seized on these concoctions as evidence that women were manipulating men into passion or betraying their vows. On the fringes of history, some recipes sound downright strange. One Italian manuscript suggests grinding dried lizards into powder and sprinkling it into a lover's drink to secure fidelity. In German folklore, carrying a slice of apple pressed under the armpit and then offering it to a beloved was said to inspire irresistible desire. It's bizarre, a little gross, and definitely the kind of cure you wouldn't find in today's pharmacy aisle. Yet such tales fueled paranoia. If women could stir desire with secret brews, who could say they hadn't ensnared kings, knights, or priests? Historians still argue whether women actually used these potions or whether the recipes were more myth than practice. Were love philters genuinely common, or were they simply stories told by suspicious men eager to explain why they had strayed, or why they felt drawn to women society disapproved of? Whatever the truth, the mere suspicion that a woman had dabbled in potions was enough to blacken her name. Picture it. You step deeper into the apothecary. The shelves creak under jars filled with powders of every colour. A woman slips in quietly, her hood low. She whispers her request. A draught to keep my husband close, or a tonic for sleepless nights. The apothecary nods, measures herbs, ties them in paper. Outside, a neighbour watches, already whispering. She buys secret powders, what for? By the time she reaches her doorstep, the story has grown claws. The cruel irony. Men often sought the same potions too, philters to stir passion in mistresses, tonics for virility, but when discovered, their curiosity was dismissed as a peccadillo, a joke. Women, however, bore the weight of scandal. You probably wouldn't want your lavender sachet mistaken for a spell of seduction, yet countless women saw harmless herbs turned into evidence of betrayal. And so, love potions became both scapegoat and snare, proof of guilt where none existed, and a convenient excuse for those who wanted women condemned. The apothecary's jars stand silent, but each one holds more than herbs. They hold centuries of suspicion, scandal, and the cruel alchemy of turning ordinary remedies into accusations of sin. The apothecary's shelves dim into shadow, their jars of herbs fading, and now you find yourself once again in a royal palace. The air smells of beeswax and polished wood, the corridors hushed, and yet an unease pulses beneath the gilded calm. Because here, behind closed doors, not every queen's disgrace was public. Some ended quietly, with sudden illnesses, swift funerals, and rumours buried in silence. Welcome to the world of royal cover-ups and quiet executions. Ever wondered how many queens truly died of fever or fell ill unexpectedly? Court records are full of these neat explanations, but behind them often lay suspicion of infidelity, treason, or simply inconvenient presence. It was far easier to announce a tragic illness than to parade a queen's supposed betrayal through scandalous trials. Death in silence maintained dignity for the crown, not for her. A mainstream historical fact, in 16th century Spain, Philip II's young queen Elizabeth of Valois died suddenly at the age of 23. Officially, she succumbed to illness, but rumours whispered that her independence and her close relationships at court raised suspicions of infidelity. While no formal charges were ever made, the whispers outlived her, a quiet reminder that not all queens fell beneath swords. Some faded conveniently in bedchambers. On the fringes of history, you find darker tales. In Renaissance Italy, chronicles tell of noblewomen given poisoned cups of wine by their own families, deaths recorded as natural, while everyone in the palace knew otherwise. One story tells of a duchess locked in her apartments for months until her decline was announced with solemnity. Was she truly ill, or was she starved, silenced, erased? Historians still argue whether these accounts are fact or legend, but the recurrence of such stories suggests a pattern too common to dismiss. Picture it in your imagination. A queen lies in her chamber, the air heavy with incense. Physicians hover, muttering about fevers and vapours. Outside, courtiers whisper, too loudly, that she had grown too close to a foreign envoy, or that her husband's trust had faltered. Within days the bells toll, and the court mourns with elaborate ceremony. Yet beneath the solemnity lies relief, even calculation. Her death solves a problem without spectacle. The cruel irony: these quiet executions or suspicious illnesses were often portrayed as merciful. Better a gentle decline than a bloody scaffold. But for the women themselves, there was no mercy. You probably wouldn't want your last days rewritten as a dignified passing, when in truth they may have been anything but, and the cover-up served more than convenience. They protected dynasties. Public trials risked scandal spreading across Europe, shaking alliances and negotiations. A quiet death allowed kings to remarry swiftly, to restore appearances without inviting dangerous questions. Silence was safer than spectacle. You leave the chamber in your imagination. The curtains pulled closed around the queen's bed. Her face pale and still. The courtiers file out solemnly, but you hear the whispers in the hall sharper than grief. She strayed. She betrayed. She deserved it. And with that, her story ends not in thunder, but in a suffocating hush. The hush of the death chamber lingers, but now you step into a modern-feeling space, a scholar's office piled high with books, manuscripts, and half-drunk cups of tea. Papers spill across the desk, each one a fragment of a forgotten woman's story. Because long after the executions, the branding irons and the whispered rumours faded, historians began chasing ghosts, trying to piece together what really happened to women accused of infidelity. Ever wondered how much of history is simply rumour carved into stone? Imagine combing through a centuries-old court record that says only she was found guilty of adultery and punished accordingly. No details, no defence, no names of witnesses, just the final blow. The truth of her life vanishes into the margins, leaving modern scholars to argue endlessly over what actually took place. A mainstream historical fact. Historians studying Anne Boleyn's downfall still cannot agree whether the charges of infidelity were entirely fabricated or whether Henry VIII's court manipulated a few half-truths. The records are riddled with contradictions, confessions under pressure, and missing evidence. Even today, nearly 500 years later, the debate remains unsettled. On the fringes, some historians chase whispers into folklore. In rural archives, they find notes about a wife drowned for betrayal, or a woman enclosed for her sins, with no further explanation. Were these real events, or morality tales written down as warnings? Sometimes the only trace is a ballad or a local legend passed down so many times it's impossible to separate fact from invention. Historians still argue whether the majority of women accused of infidelity were genuinely suspected or whether many accusations were politically motivated. Was gossip the true weapon or law itself? The debate won't end because the evidence is both too scarce and too stained by bias. And in that ambiguity lies tragedy, the silence of the women themselves. Picture it. A modern scholar sits in a quiet archive, gloved hands turning brittle pages, marginal notes scribbled by clerks centuries ago mock the accused, while official decrees speak with cold certainty. The scholar sighs, aware that every truth is built on silence and supposition. The women's voices are gone, erased by time, leaving only accusations recorded by their enemies. The cruel irony. History preserved the scandals, but not the truths. You probably wouldn't want your entire life remembered only through the insults of people who hated you. Yet that's exactly what happened to so many accused women. Their laughter, their kindness, their innocence, lost. Only the accusations endured, fossilized in ink. And so historians chase these ghosts, filling books with arguments over who was guilty, who was framed, and who simply fell victim to the cruelty of suspicion. They'll keep arguing, perhaps forever, because the records were never meant to tell the women's side. As you leave the scholar's office in your imagination, the stacks of papers seem to rustle, as though whispering the names of all those women whose stories will never be fully known. Their ghosts remain in margins, waiting but never quite heard. The rustle of the scholar's papers fades, and suddenly the air feels saltier, harsher. In your imagination you step onto a wharf, the wooden planks damp with sea spray, gulls crying overhead. Because suspicion did not stay confined to Europe's castles and courts, it crossed the ocean. In the colonies of the New World, women accused of infidelity found themselves judged with the same old cruelty, reshaped under Puritan rules and colonial anxieties. Ever wondered how far gossip can travel? Imagine stepping off a ship in 17th century Massachusetts, a world carved out of wilderness and strict morality. The settlements are small, the churches domineering, the laws merciless. Here, a woman's reputation is her armor, and once it cracks, there is no protection. A mainstream historical fact. In colonial New England, adultery was a capital crime on the books. Though executions were rare, public punishments were not. Women accused of infidelity might be whipped, branded, or forced to wear a letter stitched onto their clothes. The notorious Scarlet A. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, though fiction, drew from very real practices. For women in Puritan society, shame was considered both punishment and deterrent. On the fringes of history, some colonial courts carried over older European punishments with a peculiar twist. Records mention ducking stools, chairs used to plunge accused women into ponds or rivers, not to drown them, but to humiliate them in front of the community. Other accounts tell of women standing on meeting house steps with signs hung around their necks reading "Adulteress," forced to endure the stares of every neighbor they knew. Historians still argue whether colonial authorities truly believed these punishments were effective in deterring sin, or whether they were more about reinforcing community control. Was it morality, or was it power disguised as piety? Either way, the message was unmistakable. A woman's fidelity was a public concern, policed by the entire town. Picture it vividly, a New England settlement, its streets muddy, the scent of pine smoke hanging in the air. The accused woman stands in the stocks, her back striped from the whip. Children giggle, men sneer, women avert their eyes. Somewhere in the crowd, a preacher shouts about Eve, sin and temptation. The woman lowers her head, the scarlet A, catching the light like an open wound stitched onto fabric. The cruel irony: male infidelity in the colonies, though technically punishable, was often ignored or lightly judged. A man's dalliance might be excused as weakness. A woman's alleged straying, even without proof, was treated as poison to the entire community. You probably wouldn't want your marriage policed by neighbors who watched your every move. Yet in the New World, that was the reality. And the reach of these accusations stretched beyond the colonies. In Spanish America, too, women accused of betrayal faced ecclesiastical courts that merged religious authority with civic punishment. Whispers in Lima or Mexico City could destroy noble families just as swiftly as whispers in London or Paris. As you leave the wharf in your imagination, the gulls circle above, shrieking like echoes of gossip carried on the wind. Across oceans and continents, the fate of accused women followed the same pattern: suspicion, spectacle, silence. The cruelty of the old world arrived neatly packed in the sails of the new. The gulls fade into the distance, their cries thinning into silence. You step forward in your imagination, and the centuries seem to peel away. The colonial streets dissolve into cobbled Victorian lanes, gas lamps flickering against the mist. The rules of society look different now: lace gloves, tea parlours, and novels in shop windows, but the shadow is the same. Because even as the centuries turned, the long shadow of suspicion clung stubbornly to women's lives. Ever wondered why the idea of female infidelity never stopped haunting societies, even when other medieval cruelties faded? It's because suspicion itself is a timeless ghost. You can change the clothes, the courts, the punishments, but the whispers don't die. They only change shape. A mainstream historical fact. In Victorian England, adultery was still grounds for divorce, but only men could easily secure it. The 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act allowed a husband to divorce his wife on proof of adultery alone. A wife, by contrast, had to prove adultery, plus another offence like cruelty or desertion. The law itself enshrined the double standard, leaving women's reputations dangling by a thinner thread than men's. On the fringes of history, even the new science of the 19th century found ways to fuel suspicion. Some so-called physicians claimed they could detect a woman's unfaithfulness by the shape of her skull or the lines of her face, a bizarre pseudoscience called physiognomy. One pamphlet declared that the wayward wife could be spotted by the curve of her lips. You'd laugh if it hadn't condemned so many to ridicule. Historians still argue whether Victorian anxieties about women were driven more by morality or by fear of social upheaval. Was suspicion really about fidelity, or was it about controlling women in a world where they were gaining more visibility, in schools, in literature, in politics? The debate continues, but what's undeniable is that accusations of infidelity remained a potent tool to silence women stepping beyond their prescribed roles. Picture it. A respectable woman, corseted and gloved, walks arm in arm with a male friend through a park. A passerby raises an eyebrow. By evening, whispers start. She's far too familiar. By morning, the gossip runs through drawing rooms like fire. One chance meeting can ruin her standing at the very tea parties that sustained her place in society. The dresses may be finer, the punishments less bloody, but the result is the same: shame, exclusion, erasure. The cruel irony: even as novels and plays of the 19th century explored themes of love, passion, and women's desires, society punished real women for those same impulses. Fiction gave them voices. Life silenced them. You probably wouldn't want your own book club to gossip you into disgrace, yet countless Victorian women found their reputation shredded by little more than tea-time whispers. And suspicion didn't stop in Europe. In America, too, women lived under the same long shadow. Divorce trials made headlines, with the accused woman's supposed betrayals splashed across newspapers as titillating scandal. Infidelity became entertainment once more, feeding a culture hungry for spectacle at the expense of real lives. As you leave the misty Victorian streets in your imagination, the glow of the lamps dims, but the shadow remains, proof that the cruelty of suspicion wasn't confined to one time or place. It lingered, evolving, creeping forward into every new age, always waiting to strike again. The gas lamps dim, and now the centuries seem to blur together until you find yourself in a dreamlike space, part castle, part courtroom, part city street. Whispers curl around you like smoke, every era's suspicion echoing at once. The laughter of a tavern, the chant of monks, the clang of iron, the sigh of a queen. It's here, in this twilight of memory, that you face the final truth, whispered endings and fading lights. Ever wondered how much of history is really just fear, replayed in different costumes? Whether in medieval villages, Renaissance palaces, Puritan towns, or Victorian parlours, women accused of infidelity were never just individuals, they were symbols. Their supposed betrayal threatened not only husbands, but dynasties, communities, and even entire kingdoms. And so suspicion was never small, it always carried the weight of nations, a mainstream historical fact. Even into the 20th century, women faced legal and social penalties for adultery far harsher than men. In some countries, laws against female infidelity remained on the books while men's betrayals were ignored. The echoes of medieval double standards carried forward, proof that the shadow of suspicion never truly left. On the fringes of memory, you hear the voices of those forgotten women. Some chroniclers hint at wives locked away in towers whose names never appeared in the record. Others tell of anonymous songs mocking the milkmaid who strayed. Her identity erased, but her shame immortalized in rhyme. These fragments remind you that countless women vanished into silence, their stories unrecorded, their innocence never defended. Historians still argue how many of these accusations were true, how many were fabricated, and how many were simply convenient excuses for cruelty. But maybe the question misses the point. Whether guilty or innocent, women's fates were rarely in their own hands. The real crime was the system that allowed suspicion to kill reputations, families, and lives with such ease. Picture it in your imagination, the long procession of women through time, each one carrying the weight of whispers. A queen in silks, a peasant in wool, a colonist in rough homespun, all walking into the shadows of suspicion, their steps muffled but endless. Behind them the crowd whispers still, unable to stop. The cruel irony, even when history remembers them, it often remembers the accusation louder than the truth. You probably wouldn't want to be remembered only for a rumor, yet many of these women have no legacy but the cruelty they endured. And now the lights in this imagined space begin to fade. The smoke of torches dissolves into the hum of your room, the whispers thinning into silence. All that remains is the heavy knowledge of how suspicion haunted women across centuries, and the faint hope that by remembering, you restore a sliver of the humanity stolen from them. Now let the echoes soften, let the torches gutter low, the whispers fall quiet, the scaffolds and cloisters dissolve into dusk. You've walked through centuries of fear and accusation, and perhaps the weight feels heavy, but you don't need to carry it into your dreams. Let it settle here in history's long corridors while you drift somewhere gentler. Breathe slowly. Imagine the stone walls around you turning warm with candlelight, not threatening but soothing. The echoes fade into lullabies instead of gossip, the jeers replaced by a hush of wind outside. You no longer see chains or masks, you see open fields, wide skies, and the comfort of night closing gently around you. The women whose stories you've glimpsed fade into silhouettes now, but not erased. They are lighter, freer, walking away from the courts and the crowds, leaving only peace in their wake. Their burdens slip into silence. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, let your own breath mirror theirs. Steady, calm, unhurried. The world outside your room may still carry its own whispers, but for now none of them matter. Only the rhythm of your heartbeat, only the softness of the dark, only the quiet turning of time. If your mind drifts, let it drift toward gentler shores. Picture waves lapping slowly, endlessly. Picture the safe hum of a fan in the background, steady as the tide. Picture yourself floating, untethered, free of every shadow, The cruel fates you've just heard belong to history now. What you carry into your dreams should be lighter. Only calm, only rest, only sleep. So close your eyes, let the last images dim, and let yourself drift gently into the quiet where no suspicion follows.